You hear a lot of criticism about Congress these days, some of it warranted. Much of it, in my own opinion, is not. But one guy who is absolutely serving his country and his district superbly is someone I've known for quite a while, Congressman Chaka Fattah. Is now in his 10th term in the House, the 2nd District of Pennsylvania. He's a member of the very powerful House Appropriations Committee and the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science and Related Agencies. Very important subcommittee for a lot of the people in this room. And he's also the chairman of the Congressional Urban Caucus. Most important, Congressman Fattah leads the Fattah Neuroscience Initiative. The initiative promotes research and discovery in brain cognition, development, disease, and industry. I can't think of anyone more appropriate to be speaking to us from Congress today than Congressman Chaka Fattah. Please welcome him.
The World Health Organization, in one of its latest reports, indicates that there are over 1 billion people in our world who suffer from neurological-based diseases or disorders. The National Institutes of Health say that well over 50 million Americans. You've heard earlier today that there are close to 5 million suffering from Alzheimer's alone. And it is an appropriate moment for us to have a summit like this here in Washington, to focus in on brain health. And to be able to join again with Ambassador Glassman, who's here. I told him earlier today that he moved from doing the work of angels to the dark side for a minute. This is an internal joke, but it is an honor to be back together again for this purpose. For the inaugural awardee, there could not be another person anywhere in the country more deserving. General, let's give the General another round of applause, please, for his great work leading One Mind. And I want to say to Senator Grassley, who has done just an extraordinary job in his work in the United States Senate, for him to take time to come today also, I think, puts an appropriate focus on these issues. But let me spend some time talking about what it is that I am doing. I'm the lead Democrat on science-related appropriations, and I made one very important decision when I took over this position almost 4 years ago, and that is that superior among equal on all of the matters for scientific investigation for our government, the human brain is number one. And not only have I made this decision, it's been joined in by my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans on the Appropriations Committee. It's a bipartisan initiative. And what the first thing we've done is we created, as lawmakers do, we write laws, right? We wrote this down. We required the executive branch to gather together the entire federal enterprise that's involved in scientific investigation and healthcare research. So over 20 different entities of the federal government, co-chaired by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, we created the first ever high priority research effort. And we said neuroscience is the topic. And we've had now, over these 2 years, a great deal of work done, laying out what was required, which was a disruptive, non-incremental path forward so that we can make some progress. And I want to tell you why this is so important. Because we have some over 500 plus diseases and disorders of the of the brain. You can take out the name of each of these diseases or disorders, and the paragraph essentially reads the same. That is that we don't exactly know how they start. We don't have any effective treatment, and we are not yet convinced that we have anything in clinical trials that's going to become an effective treatment. That furthermore, that when we look at the issue of research itself, that unlike all of the other healthcare research, in which there's usually a 50% translation from animal to humans, that when we look at neuroscience or brain-related diseases and disorders, there's only a 1% translation from a research that looks good in animals to what might actually help with human beings. And last year we spent $213 billion on Alzheimer's care. I'm talking about care. Not for research, not for prevention. And if you take all of the neuroscience funding together and you lump it all together from NIH to all the way through all of these entities, you can't find $10 billion. So we're spending 200 plus billion. Half the patients in the nation's nursing homes today have Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. And with 10% of the population at 65 with Alzheimer's, and 40% of our population at 80 and above with Alzheimer's, it tells you something about what the picture looks like in a country in which the largest growing demographic is 80 to 90 years old. Because we're all living longer, these challenges are more important. When we look at our soldiers who are injured, 40% of the injured soldiers have a traumatic brain injury. Post-traumatic stress. I visited the National Center for the Intrepid over at Bethesda. But I've been visiting all around. I've been in laboratories all across our country, from University of Washington in St. Louis to Columbia. Last week I was at MIT and Boston University. I've been to all of the great universities in my part of the country, University of Penn and Cooper, Drexel, Jefferson. But as you travel around and you ask this question of Nobel laureates and other scientists, you say, what percentage of what we need to know about the human brain do we now know? You get almost a uniform response of about 1%. That we know about 1%. I saw an operation on a gentleman who had a brain tumor. I was watching this in this operating room was donated by one of our leading foundations. It's about a $15 million state-of-the-art operating room. And it had all these different bells and whistles, and it had these big screens up. And the surgeon comes back out, Mr. Ambassador, and he greets me after he's done this operation. And I said, you know, I'm trying to figure out what else you need so that you can be effective at what you're doing. He's one of the best surgeons in the world. And he said to me, he said, I need better imaging tools. And I'm a novice at this. I'm looking at these big screens, and you can see every little part of what he's doing inside this brain. I said, well, it looks like you can see everything. And he says, well, I can see the cell, but I need to see inside the cell. And I was thinking about that because, you know, we've invested, by the time we launch the James Webb Telescope, we will have invested $8 billion of your money into this telescope. Now, I'm all for the telescope. Don't misunderstand. I think our country needs to invest in big science. But I would hope that if a surgeon was operating on my brain, that whatever imaging tool he thought he needed or she thought that she needed, that it would be available. So I just kind of think that we need to have a set of priorities that tilt a little bit more earthward, at least in terms of making sure that what our surgeons need, what our researchers need. Now, there's some exciting news. I'm so happy that the University of Texas is doing the work that you're doing, Sandy, because, and I had an opportunity, we had in Philadelphia, Dr. Sutu from the University of Texas at Houston come out and do a briefing on his work on He's looking at Alzheimer's. He's looking at a number of things. And then I arranged for him to give a briefing through a video conference in Washington because he's got a fascinating notion that I think, and I've heard this as I moved around the country in different pieces and parts, that many of these diseases do, and this was mentioned earlier in the question and answers, is that there's many of these diseases seem to maybe have at their core some commonality. And his work shows that, and his work is joined in by Nobel laureates like Stanley Prusner and a group of others, that there may be this misfolding prion that depending on how it misfolds, you might have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or, or some other disease, but that if we could invest more so that we could see at a subcell level, I think we can make a lot more progress in this regard. So imaging is a big deal, and you're going to hear a little bit more from us on this issue as we finish this year's spending bill, because we're going to push for a major effort in this imaging, because we need to be able to see so that we can understand better. And let me try to make this point, because we're trying to bring together now some of the brain mapping efforts. So one of the first things that the Fattah Neuroscience Initiative brought forward out of the working group was the notion that we're going to map the human brain. So I was sitting there in the East Room when the president walked out, and he said, we're going to map the human brain. And this is a major endeavor. This is like the Human Genome Project, but it's for the brain. And I want to spend about 3 minutes on this because it's so very important for you to understand that in our brains, in this almost 3 pounds between our ears, that there's somewhat upwards of 100 billion neurons. And there are trillions of connections, interconnections between them. And both electrical and chemical, there's a lot of things going on in our brains. And there's not one scientist anywhere who can tell you what one of these neurons actually does. They can tell you what happens in sections of your brain. Here's the visual cortex, and here's some other area. But lo and behold, we need to figure out how the brain actually works. We need to figure out how a healthy brain works. The Europeans, my friends, have put up $1.5 billion in a Human Brain Initiative, a Human Brain Project. And they're trying to map the brain. And we have a number of other efforts around the world. The Australians have put $250 million on the table to create what they call the bionic brain. Well, the U.S. effort is critical because what it starts with is the basic fundamental challenge, and that is that we don't yet have the tools to map the brain. That is to say that the brain is so complex. We don't now, today, know how a brain with 302 neurons, that's a worm's brain, we don't know how that brain functions. We don't understand the neural networks that interact in the worm's brain, let alone start to understand how a human brain works. So what our effort is around building better tools. The Europeans have a viewpoint that I think is compatible, even though it takes a different approach. And I'm working now to see on what basis we may be able to work together on this endeavor. I spent some time not just visiting laboratories here, but I've spent some time overseas. I was at the Israeli Brain Technology Conference, and I was at the Healthy Brain, Healthy Europe effort in Ireland. There's a lot of excitement around the world that perhaps nations could actually work together on something that could benefit all of humankind. And I am hopeful that the United States will be at the very forefront of this. In fact, I'm convinced that we will be. But there's so much more for us to do. And as you gather for this Brain Summit, I would tell you that as you mark this, as you come back next year and the year after, you're going to see, I think, extraordinary progress in this regard. So whether it is through the Interagency Working Group in its ongoing activities, we now have an accelerated partnership with the pharmaceutical industry announced by NIH, putting Alzheimer's and a number of other diseases in a much different track. And the general mentioned earlier that how we go about some of these challenges has been not as, maybe has been a little bit too deliberate I'm going to understate his point about how slow at times we can be. So this takes a much more accelerated approach in terms of the pharmaceutical side, which we need, because as I visited labs, I noticed a lot of interest in the health of mice. But when I visit with the pharmaceutical companies, they are very focused on the health of human beings. And I do think that some of this private sector know-how is very, very important. I was at a lab with Pfizer. They showed me something that no one would ever have thought of. I think, well, at least I would not have thought of it. Let me put it to you like that. I don't want to understate what someone else would have thought. But they were like, okay, you remember that doctor who's doing the operation on the brain tumor? Well, Pfizer had created a process whereby they could be on site when these operations were taking place, so that when tumors were taken out of someone's brain, they could immediately have that and be able to test it on some of their potential solutions to some of the challenges in our brains related to brain cancer. And it just shows you what happens when people are focused on finding a solution. Because if the problem of translation from animal to human, you know, if 99% is none of it's translatable, we need to find human brains we can work with. And of course, none of us want to volunteer our brains because we're using them, at least some of the time. So they had a solution to at least part of this challenge. And I think that we need to appreciate the fact that the pharmaceutical industry, which had been at one point in full retreat on brain research, has now been moved back into the fold. That was our second, so we did the working group, then we put this language on the pharmaceutical industry, because my position is we need to use a carrot approach like we did with childhood vaccinations. When the pharmaceutical community moved away from childhood vaccines, we created a win-win that engaged them back in, and we need to do the same. And that means that, yes, we might have to lengthen the period on patents, but if we got 500 diseases and no solutions, I think having a few more months of patent exclusivity or a few more years, if you can help us find a cure for Alzheimer's, I think that's something, that's a trade-off that we might be able to live with as a society. You know, I think that there's a deal to be made. And, you know, in Washington, we make deals. And so that's why we pushed in that regard. In the funding bill that the president signed a few months ago, we had our latest rendition of our language, which called for the executive branch now to work towards internationalizing collaboration on brain research. Now, this, I think, is the holy grail, because I've had some research commission that never existed before, but looked at where the best brain search in the world was being done. There's actually an empirical way in which this is studied. This is not a political judgment. And look at what is actually being done and is measured in the profession by how many times your research is cited and the volumes and so on. And we found out something. We found out that the best research in the world on the human brain and on diseases therein is happening right here in the United States of America. But second to that is the European Union, and third is Israel. And so when I have said that we're going to create a marriage between these efforts, it's because I think that if we can get the best people in the world, not just doing their best, but also working together, and we can create open source, and this was mentioned earlier in your session, open source research material, and there's a model for this. It happens to take place in Massachusetts. I was visiting with Governor Deval Patrick. He created a model in which they got a few pharmaceutical companies, a few universities, and they've agreed to cooperate on neuroscience work and to share it openly on a pre-competitive basis, because there's a lot of runway room here for us to work together and to make progress, because in actuality, not enough progress is being made so far, right? So I want to move to my conclusion by saying a couple of things. One is that on the patient advocacy side, the advocacy groups for these a variety of these diseases have become indispensable in this effort. That is that they're funding some of the cutting edge research. So whereas before we would think of investors coming from the business side, a lot of the cutting edge research is now being invested in by the Epilepsy Foundation or Alzheimer's, the Alzheimer's Foundation, or any number of these other organizations. They're critically important as part of the initial funding stream for some of the ideas. A lot of times in the government, the only way to get something funded is if it's been funded before. That is, that kind of keep going in the same direction works pretty well in Washington, because that's why he said the general was an agitator, because he's been agitating that we go in some different directions. But so sometimes it's hard for young investigators. And most of the life-changing research that happens in healthcare happens from investigators in their first 10 years of work. That's not to say that those of us with gray hairs, the ambassador and me, might not still have a contribution or two to make. But the truth is that young people don't have a trained incapacity to already rule things out. You know, they kind of look at things very differently. And so it's very important. These advocacy groups are doing a great job. The government needs to do a much better job, and that's what I've taken on as my vocation. And every single day, in every way possible, and it doesn't matter, across a whole spectrum of activities, we're working. We're working to make sure that a new hospital being built in Germany for our soldiers has the best neurosurgery wing that could ever possibly have. We're working to make sure that NIH and the National Science Foundation and DARPA and others have the research dollars that they need. But we're also interested in making sure that in other parts of the enterprise, at the Food and Drug Administration and in agricultural research, that we're doing all of the different pieces that need to be done so that we can make progress. So I'm committed to this. I'm going to be doing this for at minimum another 10 years. And I'm convinced I'll be back here with you again, and we'll be able to talk about even more progress that we've made. So in Sandy's book, she concludes with forging this blazing path, right? And all I can tell you is that I believe that we can indeed forge a path. It does require, as Nehemiah said, to rebuild the walls, we need a mind to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman, for your intelligence and your passion and your hard work. Wow, you have been everywhere, and thank you for proving me correct when I said that there are a lot of people in Congress who are doing fabulous work that is not generally recognized. So we really appreciate it.